My guest on this episode of Leaders with Lacqua Goes Green has unique insight into running one of the world's biggest oil companies. Of course, the petroleum industry is a classic target for environmental activists and climate campaigners. His response is simple. The world needs hydrocarbons, and so we have to use them in a sustainable way. John Browne was known as the Sun King of the oil industry. He ran BP for more than a decade, overseeing a period of mergers and expansion to become one of the world's most prominent chief executives. Then in the late 90s, he became the first boss of an oil major to acknowledge the link between greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. But at the time you were seen as a bit of a black sheep.
Well, yes. I mean, the API, the American Petroleum Institute, decided to use the phrase, "he left the church."
On this episode, we discuss the challenges facing chief executives when it comes to ESG and how business leaders should approach the energy transition. Lord Browne, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
When did you have the realization that this was going to be an issue that you wanted to push forward?
It was a cumulative realization. I think when I joined the oil industry, people really behaved as if the oil industry was the important thing and nature was the servant, not the other way around. And I remember when I was working in Alaska in the late 60s, how in those days dynamite was used to make shocks to do seismic on the ground. When there was some left over, the crews would dump it armed into a lake to do some fishing. And the thing about that is, apart from it being outrageous, wrong, and everything, it destroyed the environment. The lakes got bigger, and every year they froze, and they never got smaller. They just unfroze and got bigger. When I took over as CEO, it was pretty clear that to a company which has got a lot of geoscientists inside, that a lot of geoscientists were saying, actually, there is something here, you know. The probabilities of humankind changing the climate were getting stronger and stronger. So when I took over, we immediately did a very big study, again, of what we should do and what our position should be. And it was crystal clear to us that we had to do something. I was the person to make the speech at Stanford to say, this is something that we're going to do something about. It's a problem, and we need to now start taking steps. And here's our plan with targets. And we went ahead and announced it.
But at the time you were seen as a bit of a black sheep?
Well, yes. I mean, the API, the American Petroleum Institute, decided to use the phrase, "he left the church." I think the problem with 97 is that the industry immediately thought it was an existential threat, that they'd be closed down and nothing could be done. And I think that was the wrong attitude then, it's the wrong attitude now. We obviously need hydrocarbons, but the key thing we do need to do is to replace them in an orderly manner and make sure they don't put emissions into the atmosphere. And had we started early, the problem would have been easier to solve.
But Lord Browne, was it difficult at the time, actually being, within the club, maybe thrown out, at the margins of the club? Did you feel that you could have done more had you had more peer support?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there was peer support in Europe. It varied, depended on, whether it was a state company or a private company. And I have to say, Shell was very supportive at the time. My opposite number there was very, very supportive indeed. And I think, but in the US, I'm afraid we were rather, actually sometimes made a joke of. In some, people say, well, they're the people who hug trees, And we didn't hug trees. We wanted to stop humankind destroying the environment, the atmosphere.
2024, how much progress have we made?
Not enough. Not enough. I go back to say, I think we've almost lost a lot of the quarter century between, talking about climate and today. We lost a lot of time, and the problems got bigger and bigger as a result. There were moments where the world was aligned, and there were moments when the oil and gas industry might have been aligned, but I'd say that the support to do something about climate change is not strong enough to guarantee delivery at the moment.
So why? It feels sometimes that we're confusing everything. It's wokeism. Again, we talk about tree huggers. There's a lot of political division in the US, and so the chief executives today feel like they need to backtrack on some of the promises they've made.
So I think, first of all, I think we've understood that the energy transition, which is at the heart of solving the issue of climate change, is more complicated and more difficult to do than anyone imagined. And especially there are three things going on here. First is, how do you get rid of the greenhouse gas emissions? Secondly, how do you make sure energy is secure? In other words, the lights come on every day. And thirdly, what about the cost of it all? Now, people selectively take bits of it. So very valid, arguments are made by people who are well-meaning that the only thing we must do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it doesn't matter about anything else. The only problem with that is, we would stop as a civilization. Without energy, we can't do anything. Then people say security is the only thing that matters, therefore we need to drill for more oil, develop more gas, and be self-sufficient. That's also wrong, because the world still works with relationships. And besides, there are many other ways of getting security. And then cost comes in and people say it's all too expensive. But actually, every time you do something new, you adjust the way you do the technology and operations to get the cost down.
But what you're talking about it feels like common sense, and it's kind of being in the center of trying to find this equation. But it seems so polarized, especially in the US. You have Exxon going after shareholders that are climate activists. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't agree with it. I do believe that, I say to people, I have not come across an investor in a company who listens to all these criticisms about ESG and climate and so-called wokeism, and nobody has said to me, what I really want to do is invest in irresponsible companies. They actually want to invest in responsible companies.
But do you feel chief executives don't want to speak up on ESG? We went through analysis saying actually the word ESG in financial statements is far below what it was 2 years ago.
There's always a reason. People want to invest in responsible companies. ESG got a bad name, much as corporate social responsibility did, when it got detached from the day-to-day activities of a company. So you had people on the side dealing with ESG, as opposed to the head of marketing or the head of production or the factory. When it's embedded, nobody kind of notices. When it becomes a big deal, people notice it and say, a company is not in the business to do ESG. A company is in the business to do things for shareholders in line with ESG. It's gone upside down.
But does it slow down to the transition, or is it still at the same pace, but we just don't really talk about it?
So some of it will be at the same pace, some will slow down. And ESG is not just climate. It's lots of other things, some of which could be very damaging. I don't like the idea that DEI or EDI, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on, people say, well, we're done with that. We're not done with that. As a gay man, I know we're absolutely not done with that. And it's outrageous to think that we should set that to one side to have people not be treated with fairness and equality inside at least corporations, not least in society.
Coming up, John Browne tells me about his personal journey and how it's shaped his approach to leadership and ESG. John Browne was celebrated as a titan of industry when he ran oil major BP for 12 years until 2007. His career at the firm abruptly ended following a personal scandal the same year. The controversy involved a UK newspaper outing Browne's sexuality. I asked him about it. what it reveals about social tolerance, and how it connects to his approach on ESG. You've told me you found a stronger voice. You became more outspoken when you came out.
I did. I prided myself, probably wrongly, having worked in many countries, been brought up as a child in the Middle East and in the Far East, having a mother who was not British, she was Hungarian, she was a survivor from Auschwitz, and I was the son of a Holocaust survivor, and being involved with lots of people, I thought to myself, I know a lot about diversity, and I know about inclusion and not being included. But actually, when I came out, I realized that my level of understanding was not very high. And actually, I could see both the support and the rejection of being different, and what you had to do to live a life where you were different. And I'm immensely pleased that I was outed when I was 60, just under 60. Because had I not been outed, I probably would have said I could stay in the closet and still believe that I knew everything, which I didn't. And that was a very important moment for me.
Was there any bitterness in being outed instead of coming out on your terms?
No, curiously, no. I mean, I thought that I looked at myself and realized that I had a set of assumptions which were built into me in the 50s and 60s. You know, my mother would always say, never tell anyone a secret, because they'll use it against you. And never be, an identifiable member of a minority, because when the going gets tough, the majority always hurt the minority. Both of these things are actually true. They really are true in life experience. But they were drilled into me, and then it were lots of, homophobic jokes and things like that. So I got into the closet, threw away the key, and then I didn't change anything. And of course, life started changing, but I didn't change in line with life, that aspect of me. And I'm very pleased that, when I had a shock that to be outed, I realized that what I'd done was wrong, and I should have I should have looked around. I should have just said, tell me about myself. When I presented my book, The Glass Closet, which I wrote about coming out in business and being gay in business, was a decade ago, I presented at the Hay Festival. And right at the end of the presentation, a man stood up in the audience and he said, I work for one of your competitors. And he said, we all knew you were gay for a long time. The problem was none of us were brave enough to come and tell you were gay. And I thought that said everything.
Do you not feel, Lord Browne, like in 2024, we're going backwards in acceptance?
We are. We're definitely going backwards, and people are going back into at least being quiet, whether they're in the closet, but they're definitely being quiet. And again, in corporate life, in the S&P 500, I think there are like 5 openly gay CEOs. So, that statistically can't be possible. So something's happening here about, conservative thinking, people maybe not aspiring to the top job, people being concerned that it'll get in the way. That's wrong. And we need to change that. It goes, this problem is gender. We've been at gender for a long time, and we're making some, not complete inroads there. Being LGBT is a bit behind that. It needs to make up for lost time here, and it can't at the moment.
But Lord Browne, being woke has been vilified by certain members of certain parties and society. Does that kind of encompass all liberal values? Like, I don't know how you see wokeism. Is there a phenomenon that kind of, it's very easy to go back to maybe 30, 40 years ago because of this anti-woke sentiment?
We're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, literally. I mean, it's throwing everything out, saying it's all woke. Now, some people, I come back to the question of purpose. Purpose of a company is obviously to create goods and services which are compatible with society, that actually make money for their shareholders. The companies are not in the business of just doing ESG. And when it looks like the company's just doing ESG, people react against it. They're saying you're being too woke. Actually, it's part and parcel of everyday business. That's where it should sit. And that's what I'm worried when people say it's woke, because there's far too much emphasis. It looks as if that's all you're doing as a business. And clearly you're doing much more than that.
So would you put humanity at the middle of this? I know you've spoken before about the law of Gaia, which is basically the idea that nature takes care of itself, but what you're trying to fix is humanity.
Exactly. People, I remember being scolded by many people when I say, we're here to save the world. They'd all look at me and say, Earth, big system, take care of itself. The only problem is it may destroy human beings, but the Earth, it'll recover. It's got billions of years to go. We don't necessarily. So we have to look after humanity, which means we need to, insofar as possible, create a society where people work with each other, live with each other, and create forward progress, so that everybody has a slice of the action which improves their life. Now, that's terribly idealistic, and one has to be pragmatic, and things go right and wrong. Of course they do. People understand that. But you hold, I think, the ideal, and you see what you can do. But the important thing, I think, coming back to the corporate life, is whenever you say something in corporate life, you need to be able to say, this is the measure I'm going to use, and this is how I'm going to get there. And the good thing about corporate life, it's a bit like medication. In fact, you have to sort of take it daily and take it at the same time and do it again and again and again.
You mean show up at work?
You've got to show up at work. You've got to, say, I'm going to do this.
No.
You do it. Having done it, you say, I'm going to do this. You do it again. And so you need to measure things. And ESG certainly had a reputation of being a lot of hand-waving, and that did not sit well with people, certainly in corporate life.
Coming up, John Browne tells me about his inspiration and the future of the energy transition. Former BP chief executive John Browne built his career at the top of the energy industry. He's now chairman of BeyondNetZero, the climate-focused unit of private equity giant General Atlantic. He spoke to me about future risks to the environment and how a chief executive can find their purpose. Is there anyone in this space you admire that is going through great lengths of making a difference, I guess, unapologetically?
Actually, I think a lot of the people who are trying to build data centers, for example, so Microsoft, people like this, are really worrying about what to do about the emissions from the electricity that they're going to use. And I admire that. I think we don't have a carbon price at the moment. Certainly in the US, every time a carbon price has gone up to the hill, it's virtually been dead on arrival. We do have a very interesting, complex set of taxes and tax reliefs called the IRA, which embed into them the cost of carbon. And many of those will continue for a long time because they're all in different states who have different red and blue attitudes. So a lot of it will kind of carry on in one way or the other. The rhetoric may be very different from the reality. So I think that'll work. The Europe is getting hold of a carbon price and carbon border adjustments and all sorts of things. So they're beginning to get the right incentives. And I think some of the big private companies are saying, we need actually to, when we can't reduce our carbon, we need to offset it with people who we know that they can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. So these are so-called technical solutions where bilaterally a big company and a big person like Climeworks and things like this, they do a deal. And it's people like Microsoft and people like that who are doing deals like that.
How does a CEO find its purpose? How did you find your purpose?
Well, it's very simple. You go around and you say, why am I here? Why am I here? And we had a very simple purpose, which was to provide energy to produce good things for humanity. Now, some people would say, you also produce some bad things because we produce things that produce greenhouse gases. True, and we tried to limit that, really limit that, and actually realize also that we could replace some of that energy with clean energy. We couldn't do everything. It was early days, and some of the stuff we did was probably wrong-headed anyway because the technology got replaced. But nonetheless, your purpose has to be very clear, and you have to line up everything against that.
Do you have regrets?
I don't have regrets, no. In fact, I think we expanded the reach of the company to provide energy which evidently helped nations grow. You know, whether they were China, and in those days we supported China, and I hope we will continue to do that in one way or another with limits on security, but I hope we do continue that, important for the world, or whether it's Azerbaijan, whether it's the UK in the North Sea, or whether it's the US in having different forms of gasoline. So I'm actually proud of what we did. There were obviously bad things happen. You know, we had an oil spill in Alaska, albeit small. But one teaspoon is too much, and it wasn't big, but it was not good, and we did something about that. And then we had an explosion on my watch in Texas, which killed 15 people, and that I remember to this day. Not so much about the way I saw people feel about what had happened. I was down there when we pulled the bodies out of the wreckage. It was not good.
Lord Browne, do you feel that with sanctions against Russia, an oil spill could be more likely because they've found ways to sell them elsewhere?
I mean, sanctions on oil really don't work unless the whole world is behind them, and they clearly weren't behind these. So people find ways around it. And one of the ways they find around it is to find ships that wouldn't necessarily be used to transport oil, or would have difficulty getting insurance, things like that, and fill them up and transport the oil. So inevitably, with this sort of activity, the risks of a spill have gone up. Surprisingly, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been one, but the risks are there. The risks are always there. It's the biggest issue with oil is spills from tankers.
Do you worry about something like a big environmental disaster, or it's impossible to...
I do, but you can't, there are so many different actors here, so many different actors. And when they're working outside the rules established internationally, anything can happen. Anything can happen.
Lord Browne, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.